My inquiry question was, how have different political leaders shaped Canada? So in this presentation, I'll be discussing different prime ministers and the impact they had on Canada. The first prime minister I selected was John A. Macdonald. Some of Macdonald's accomplishments include being the first prime minister of Canada, contributing to Confederation and helping to create the Dominion of Canada, bringing British Columbia and Prince Edward Island into the Dominion. He was knighted in recognition of his service to Great Britain. He helped form the beginning of Canada's independence, and he aided in the creation of the Canadian Pacific Railway. So, some of his ideologies were, he wanted to maintain close relations with Britain. He distrusted the US. He opposed free trade and implemented policies of trade protectionism, and he preferred a strong centralized government. He wanted a united Canada. And despite his opposition to free trade, he actually began globalization in Canada because of the Pacific Railway. Controversy. Macdonald created residential schools. He stole Indigenous land and used increasingly repressive measures against Indigenous populations. He also used Chinese laborers to build the railway and gave them life-threatening jobs for very small wages. Macdonald's government was also accused of taking bribes and election funds in exchange for the contract to build the Canadian Pacific Railway. The image on the left is the Canadian Pacific Railway being built using exploited immigrant workers. The image on the right is a residential school with young children being forced to endure terrible situations and unimaginable horrors. The ethical dimensions of Sir John A. Macdonald's actions. His actions were immoral by any standards, and they still impact us to this day. He created residential schools, which inflicted tons of pain on the Indigenous community, and recently we have discovered the bodies of 215 children buried at a Kamloops residential school. Those children died as a result of his actions, and it leads us to imagine how many others have suffered as a result of him. There were also over 600 Chinese men who died on the railroads, working to create the Canadian Pacific Railroad that John A. Macdonald created. And the anti-Asian immigration policies his government imposed still impact us, because there is a lot of prejudice towards Asian immigrants in Canada today. So many of these central issues stem from John A. Macdonald. And even though he did create this country and gave many of us our independence, his actions were immoral. The second Prime Minister is Wilfrid Laurier, and he represents the transformative era. Some of Laurier's accomplishments include creating Alberta and Saskatchewan, making a second transcontinental railway called the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. Laurier and his government set up an immigration incentive system to populate Canada, specifically the western provinces and the prairies. He also led Canada into the transformative era of industrialization and unity. He negotiated the Reciprocity Agreement. This agreement allowed free trade between Canada and the US, and he was also knighted in recognition of his service to Canada. Ideologies. Laurier had similar views to Macdonald regarding national unity and Canada's ties to Great Britain. He wanted to remain close allies with Great Britain, but also wanted some Canadian independence. He focused on agricultural growth in the prairies and encouraged industrial growth in the east. Laurier also supported new immigrants and settlers, largely from Eastern Europe. Controversy. Many Canadian residents, especially French-speaking residents, were very angry about the incoming settlers. They feared Canada would be overrun with these foreigners and their culture would be in danger, and they would become an even smaller minority in an increasingly English-speaking nation. These new immigrants also posed an issue for Indigenous peoples. As more immigrants settled, more tribes were pushed off their lands and their youth were forced into residential schools. This is an image of an immigrant family farming. These farms were a huge responsibility and all members of the family were expected to pitch in. What is the historical significance of Laurier's choices? His choice to welcome new immigrants shaped Canada's future economy. These new settlers stimulated our agricultural market, which is now our biggest source of profit, and also led to us supplying the Allies with food in the First World War, making us Britain's breadbasket. These new immigrants also alienated the French speakers even more, and added to the growing animosity between the English and French. The choice to welcome these new farmers also negatively impacted the First Nations. So Laurier's choice did have a mixed effect, and it is important to learn from his mistakes and continue his positive legacy. The next Prime Minister I chose is Robert Borden. Borden's accomplishments. He led Canada through the First World War, he formed the Unionist Party, and he negotiated greater autonomy for Canada. Specifically, he insisted Canada would sign the Treaty of Versailles and be properly represented in the League of Nations. He was also the last Canadian Prime Minister to be knighted. Ideologies. Borden wanted greater independence from Great Britain. He believed in the total war effort and wholeheartedly supported Canada's involvement in World War I, and he opposed free trade between Canada and the US. Borden actually led the opposition to the Reciprocity Agreement, which was created by Laurier's government. Controversy. Borden announced mandatory conscription for males aged 20 to 45 on May 18, 1917. This declaration enraged many Canadians, especially French-speaking residents. They felt no attachment to the war and did not want to get involved. Borden was also responsible for the Kamagata-Maru tragedy. His government turned away a ship of refugees fleeing India on the eve of World War I. Many passengers died on their return, and when they reached India, a majority were arrested and accused of being dangerous revolutionaries. Here there are two images. On the left, there is Borden giving a speech to Canadian troops, and on the right, it is the passengers of the Kamagata-Maru. What are the different historical perspectives of these events? In the conscription crisis, there are two very distinct perspectives, one from English-speaking residents and the other from French-speaking residents. The English speakers felt a sense of patriotism and wanted to fight and die for their country. The French speakers didn't feel a sense of loyalty, and they felt independent and different from the rest of the country, and wished to stay uninvolved. In the Kamagata-Maru incident, the passengers felt very hopeful, and they hoped Canada would accept them and help them in their time of need. The citizens and government were suspicious of these travelers, and they feared they would endanger the rest of Canada. Next is R.B. Bennett. Accomplishments. Bennett implemented many relief programs for the unemployed, especially farmers. He created the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission to ensure Canadian content would be consumed, and he established a Royal Commission, which was the first step into creating the Bank of Canada. Ideologies. Bennett's platform was mainly based on recovery from the Great Depression. He believed in governmental intervention in the economy. Bennett was also against free trade and imposed trade tariffs. He thought this would help the Canadian economy. Controversy. Bennett's government was largely ineffectual in protecting Canadians from the hardship of the Great Depression. In 1932, Bennett created relief camps which housed unemployed men and paid them low wages for meaningless labor. This resulted in strikes from the men in the camps and eventually a months-long protest called On to Ottawa-Trek, in which the men would ride the rails until they reached the capital, Ottawa. The camps were eventually disbanded in June 1936. This is an image inside a cabin at an unemployment relief camp. What are the causes and consequences of the unemployment relief camps? One of the major causes was growing pressure on Bennett from mayors and premiers to take action against the unemployment crisis. The situation became so bad, unemployed men were riding the rails, going from town to town, and causing some disturbances, looking for work. Bennett created this idea and began enforcing it, and arresting people for not going to the camps willingly. This, of course, caused protest. It was essentially a prison sentence, and the men were fed up. This started the On to Ottawa trek. The protesters sent a group of delegates to the capital to meet with R.B. Bennett, but Bennett did not take them seriously and basically dismissed them. This meeting was a cause of the Regina riot, which was the true consequence of the unemployment relief camps. Bennett was very heavy-handed in dealing with this riot and the protesters, and eventually one protester and one police officer was killed. The next Prime Minister I chose is William Lyon Mackenzie King. Accomplishments. King's biggest accomplishment was leading Canada through World War II. He also contributed to Canada's autonomy and was the longest-serving Prime Minister in Canadian history. He held office for 21 years. Ideologies. King wanted greater freedom for Canada, but recognized the importance of Great Britain. He negotiated trade deals and lowered tariffs. He negotiated deals with the US and Britain. After initially dismissing the Great Depression, when re-elected, King provided economic relief and governmental aid. Controversy. King's response to the Chanak affair was very controversial. He did not immediately respond to Britain's call to arms when an international dispute arose in Turkey. Instead, he held a debate in our House of Commons to determine our response. This act was a huge step towards Canadian freedom in foreign affairs. His unconventional spiritual beliefs were also a point of speculation. King frequently contacted deceased relatives and kept a detailed diary about other strange encounters and rituals. This is an image of Turkish troops in the Chanak crisis. How do we make sense of continuity and change in Canadian history? To answer this question, I would like to discuss the two world wars. In the First War, Canada was completely controlled by Britain, and we were forced to fight. In the Second War, Canada was no longer a colony. We were a dominion, and we had more freedoms. These freedoms were demonstrated in the Chanak affair by Prime Minister King when he brought the decision of Canada's involvement to our elected parliamentary members. This act showed us Canada's potential and shaped our future of becoming our own independent nation. And lastly, we have Brian Mulroney. Accomplishments. Mulroney strengthened Canada's relationship with the US. He won the largest majority government in Canadian history in the election of 1984. He negotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the Acid Rain Accord, which was an air quality agreement that significantly reduced acid rain levels and sulfur dioxide emissions. And he took a strong stand against apartheid in South Africa and was personally thanked by Nelson Mandela. Ideologies. Mulroney supported free trade agreements, he introduced policies around environmental protection, and he appealed to French speakers and wanted to recognize Quebec as a distinct society. Controversy. The failure of the Meech Lake Accord and the Charlottetown Accord, both of which were attempts to change the Constitution to get Quebec to sign it. The creation of the new goods and services tax, which citizens were strongly opposed to, and the Airbus affair, in which Mulroney's government was accused of taking secret commissions in exchange for Air Canada's purchase of Airbus jets. Primary source evidence. In these images, we can see the NAFTA deal being signed by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Mexican President Carlos Salinas, and U.S. President George W. Bush. This agreement allowed free trade between the countries of North America and was a huge step towards globalization in Canada. Each of these leaders played a big role in shaping modern Canada. All of them made mistakes, some bigger than others, and they all made positive contributions. I think that it is important we learn from their mistakes and never repeat them. We should also recognize their achievements and continue the positive aspects of their legacy. This is the end of my final presentation, and I hope you now understand how different political leaders have shaped Canada. Thank you for listening. And lastly, here are my references.